Hello, Willie.
So I am officially recording. Welcome to Humanities in the Wild, the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. I'm Willie Palomo. I'm with Utah Humanities. We're really excited and grateful that Elizabeth Shao over at Brigham City Library was down to partner with us to get people out to the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. If you haven't been yet, it's beautiful. I hope you all enjoyed a little trek in the past few weeks. And want to introduce Dr. John Benyon and Dr. Riley Nelson, who are both professors at Brigham Young University, who will be helping us kind of have a reflective conversation, yes, about what our experience was like. And yeah, this conversation is also a part of Think Water Utah, which is a larger set of programming going on all over the state to try to get people to think, yes, about our waterways and what they mean to us, and learn more about their histories. So this includes doing fun things like going on a trek to the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. I won't take up any more of your time, but thank you all for being here. And I'm gonna be letting people kind of trickle in as they go.
Good.
Okay. So if nobody has a question, if you have a question, go ahead and ask it. But if nobody does, I'll ask one myself.
Well, I thought the tie-in to the book was kind of interesting, and so I'll ask you about that. What prompted you to bring that into the conversation?
Well, it seemed natural for both of us. I won't speak for Riley. He'll say something, but we have partnered in another context, which is to teach through Brigham Young University a program called Integrated Natural History Utah.
Yeah.
And we've regularly used Refuge as one of the books we read. We have them read several books about Utah, this being one. And then we were able to one year when we ran that program to talk to Terry Tempest Williams in person at one of the students' homes. And so that was really kind of a special event. But we followed the Bear River from its origin in the Uintas, and we go to Bear Lake, which is not actually in the Bear River, but
Right.
up to Oneida Narrows, and then down to the Bear River Bird Refuge. And so we stopped several places along the Bear River and talk about its value and water and so forth. And so when we found out about Humanities in the Wild, it seemed a natural thing to pair the Bear River Bird Refuge with the book Refuge.
Just to interrupt, I will always do. There's some black-capped chickadees flying around me, so watch if any of them land behind me to take a drink of water. Some birds. Back to John.
Anyway, Riley, I think it would be valuable, since this whole thing focuses on water, is to talk about what happens to the Bear River as it goes down into the Great Salt Lake. You know, water's taken in and out of it, and it's kind of a complex and interesting event, how all the water is distributed. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, the Bear River has its headwaters in the Uinta Mountains of northern Utah, and makes a loop up through Wyoming and Idaho. And then in historical times, the Bear River never joined Bear Lake, but the Bear River continued down from near Bear Lake, within just a couple of miles, on down through the Oneida Narrows and into Cache Valley, the valley where Logan is located, and then through another gap north of Brigham City, where now there's a dam called Cutler Dam near Beaver Dam, Utah, and then continues on through the valley that Brigham City and Tremonton find themselves in, and works its way out and forms a delta going into the Great Salt Lake. So it runs for, I forget how long the Bear River is, but maybe a couple 100 miles long, and it makes that long trip. For the lower 2/3 of that of its length, it travels through heavy agricultural lands that have been used. Cache Valley is famous for its cheese, especially, and the water from the Bear River has been used to water hayfields for quite some time. There is always a tendency in humans to dam rivers and to gain control of them. And so several dams are on the Bear River now, one particularly at Cutler Dam at the edge of Cache Valley. And that's a main one. There's another one proposed up in the Oneida Narrows at the north end of Cache Valley. But once it comes out of Cutler Dam, we're now talking about Box Elder County, especially during the summer, a great deal of the water of the Bear River is funneled off into two canals, one on the east side of the Bear River and another on the west side of the Bear River. And that carries the water and distributes it out for irrigation of land. But due to quite a bit of foresight by managers way back when in the 1920s and perhaps before that, I can't remember the dates, the water rights of the Bear River, a great deal of the water was allocated to the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge because of how important this desert oasis is for migratory birds going from, south in the winter to north in the spring and summer. I could talk more about the Bear River Bird Refuge, but ask your questions and I'll fill gaps in along the way. Go ahead.
I wanted to add one more thing before we go to a different question, which is that the route of the Bear River and the history of the Bear River is balancing different users. There are farmers who want to use a lot of the water, and then there are sportsmen, and there are all people who need electricity. But the birds in the Bear River Bird Refuge need the water also. So the whole process is a balancing of water rights and water allocation. And that really fits with Terry Tempest Williams' book, because one thing the book shows for sure is that environmentally, we're all a community, humans and birds and other animals, fish, everything. We're in a community. And what impinges on one part of the community, such as the massive water that fell and came down in 83 and 84, that caused the flooding of the Bear River Bird Refuge and caused her to write the book, humans were affected as much as animals were. And we sometimes think of ourselves as separate from the non-human other, but we are all in a community. And so I think what Riley has been talking about is perfectly appropriate for that book. But let's go to another question, if anybody has one.
Given that the book looks at that period of 83, 84, what do you see in the current situation? Is it I assume much changed, and is it something that is going to continue to change as we see these higher temperatures and lower water, lower levels of water coming in?
Well, I've got to watch the Bear River Bird Refuge since age 3. I'm 64 now. So I have, in essence, 60 odd years, mostly odd because of me, 60 odd years of watching the Bear River and the Bear River Bird Refuge. As a kid, I would pedal my bicycle 15 miles out from Brigham City to the headquarters of the Bear River Bird Refuge to go fish for carp and catfish. And that's what my goal was, in part, to pedal that far on a little one-speed bike. But at that time, there was a 100-foot tower that was very, very tall out at the Bear River Bird Refuge. and you could climb that tower, and it was something like 85 steps to get to the top of it. And then you could see from above the refuge, in essence, what it all entailed. And so in 83 and 84, back then and before then, there were research laboratories where they were studying diseases that affected ducks and geese and other shorebirds. And it was a major effort that the United States government had put into learning about the birds of that area for their conservation, because millions of birds died due to disease when the water levels fluctuated. And we're talking about a high water mark in 83, 84, the most recent high water mark, really high water. Now we're back to a sort of a middling level. And that tower got knocked over in the flood. All of those research laboratories disappeared, and they moved the visitor center for the Bear River Bird Refuge from right out on the refuge to a rest stop next to the freeway closer to Brigham City. And that's a wonderful facility, that visitor center, and it introduces more people to it. So that's a big change, that some people would only make it to the visitor center and might be tempted to go off into the nether reaches out on the flats. So that's some of the big changes I've seen. I forgot to mention, in the history of the Bear River, after the big settlement of Utah and Idaho, they diverted the Bear River into Bear Lake. And then they built up one little end of Bear Lake a little bit higher so that Bear Lake became a reservoir. We look at Bear Lake now as this beautiful, pristine lake, but it was even better before the clarity of the water, before some of the things happened where the Bear River was diverted. And then there's a great big electric power plant at the north end of Bear Lake, through which the water of Bear River goes through to generate power and then head further downstream. Those are some of the changes that I've seen, and other changes I know about through the years.
If I might take a moment, I'll just directly talk about climate change and the Bear River Bird Refuge and Great Salt Lake. I've written, I haven't been able to get it published yet, but a science fiction book set in 2135. And after climate change has had some effect, and as I researched for that book, one of the things I discovered is that they believe that what could happen in the Great Basin is that we don't get less rainfall, but it's mostly in the form of rain and not snow. And so that would cut down naturally on the amount of water going down the Bear River, down the Provo River, and into the Great Salt Lake. And so the Great Salt Lake could lower in the future, not because of lack of moisture exactly, but lack of snow, moisture in the form of snow that maintains our river system. And really quickly, my thought about the connection to this book is that in what Terry Tempest Williams experienced in 83 and 84, which was the material for this book, was a dual tragedy of the women in her family dying of cancer and the Bear River Bird Refuge being destroyed. And she asks the question again and again, where is my refuge? And she comes to some conclusion that her refuge is in change. But too much change, such as is going to happen with climate change, climate disruption is too much change. And I don't know how you can adapt to that. But I think that right now, the way she thought about that tragedy of the Bear River Bird Refuge being flooded and destroyed is a little bit the way we're feeling about the pandemic right now, is that we are subject to the natural world in a way we thought we were not going to be subject to. I mean, some people imagined it and planned for it and thought about it, but I didn't. And so I can identify with Terry Tempest Williams because of the way I feel right now. In 83, 84, I wasn't worried about the Bear River Bird Refuge, but that feeling of humans being vulnerable to the natural world as climate change has greater impact, we're all going to feel that. And the poor people, as it has been shown in the pandemic, the poor people who don't have resources are going to feel it even more than anyone else. And so I think there is an interesting connection between what happened in 83, what happened now with the pandemic, and what's going to happen with climate disruption. I think that we can learn something really valuable about how vulnerable we are from all those things. Anyway, took too much time, but that's a response. Other questions?
And just because there's a lull, we can think of the refuge, we can think of the change that Terry Tempest Williams was talking about, and then I want to make sure that we remember that we're an advocate for the birds as well. And if we, when push comes to shove, the water will probably go to human use and the birds will take second off stage a little bit from that, will not get the priorities unless we lobby heavily to keep the refuge sort of as it stands as a place where water can go.
We know. Might be the Randy Jones we know.
Say that again, Richard. Your video is not on. Your audio is not on.
I think he was making a comment to his wife.
Oh, I see. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yes, I've got a question.
Not for general consumption.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I live in Brigham City, moved here a couple of years ago, and I've gotten acquainted with the refuge. I've read parts of Terry Tempest Williams' book, but I've also found out that there's this Bear River project that is proposed to move some of the water from the Bear River towards the Salt Lake, closer to Salt Lake City, to fill, needs that the valley down there will have as time goes on. The Jordan River District has a really nice conservation garden park, and they show how the water use is now, and it's about 60% of what is being supplied by nature, and in 20 or 30 years, the Salt Lake area will use more water than is currently being supplied by nature, and is constantly looking for more sources. How, like if that were to happen, the Bear River project to take some of the water south from the Bear River for domestic use, do you see hope for the refuge, like it has been, from what I can understand, two things, like an incredible visionary act by people in Brigham City 100 years ago when they saw the birds die off to create the refuge, and secondly, a good balancing act, keeping it alive despite many uses, many people using the Bear River for a variety of reasons. Can the river system and the refuge
keeping your windows up.
withstand the upcoming project if that were to go through?
That's your question, Riley.
Okay. No, that's actually not a science question. That's a society question. So that's humanities. But as a scientist and a member of society, I say if the water disappears from the basin where it currently runs, then the water levels are going to go down, and the aerial extent of the refuge that's usable by the birds will decrease. Right now, when the water can be held up at high levels, that creates around the edge more habitat around the edge. It's a longer bit of habitat. The prime habitat is the edge between water and land. If you consider if you just take a bowl, a basin of some sort, and as you lower the water in the cup, in the basin, in the bowl, then the perimeter gets smaller. And if the perimeter is related to how many birds can be there, which indeed it is, we will have fewer birds. Is that clear enough? Now we have to decide what we as human beings have to decide is a little bit, this is a little bit of a fallacy I'm going to introduce, but how many birds are worth a human? These are, I don't want to come up with an exact number for that, but every human life is valuable. It all matters. But how do you relate one to the other, and what will we tolerate? If the water levels go down enough, it can get to a point where there isn't any habitat for any of the birds. So we have to take a stand at some level. And those people 100 years ago, as you mentioned, they took a stand at a time when water wasn't quite limited the same way. We're in a different situation now, both because of societal ways that we can take the water away directly, and indirectly by changing how the water falls on the watershed that John talked about with snow and rain, and how that changes things as well.
I'll put in my 2 cents worth. Riley, in preparation for our conversation, wrote some questions, and is how part of it has to do with how do we value what resources we have, and we have is the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, is that a wealth? Is the Great Salt Lake dotted with islands of green bulwark rushes wealth? Our mothers and fathers, their stories and personalities wealth? How is our religious community personal wealth? And so the focus of Riley's questions are similar to what Terry Tempest Williams does with the book, which is to question the values of people who would, such as those constructing a hunting lodge that she has an encounter with in the chapter on the burrowing owls. She comes face to face with them and gives them an obscene gesture because she values the birds that they don't value, the burrowing owl, and they value the ducks that they can shoot. And so what do we value? And to what point do we, as Riley said, how many birds equals the value of a human? And we're going to have to, with climate disruption, we're going to have to make decisions like that. How many poor people equals one rich person? The rich people will be able to protect themselves against global climate change. People who don't have resources won't be able to. And so we're facing a situation where we are going to have to act on our values. And what will those values be? What I've learned through the change of my behavior during the pandemic is that it's hard to change behavior. It's hard not to hug my grandchildren. It's hard not to go where I want to anytime I want to. And we also learned that a lot of people aren't willing to make sacrifices. And so in the future, I think Refuge is a book that that is a map to the future of saying, wake up and figure out what you value, because your values are going to be tested by some aspect of the natural world. And I don't know that, anyway, that's what I wanted to say, is that it's a very good question about who gets the water when there isn't enough water. Are there other questions?
Yeah, keep your questions coming. I just want to say that on the trip that we took out on the road out to the Bear River Bird Refuge, I paid particular attention to passing the particular duck club, the hunting lodge that Terry Tempest Williams talks about in the first couple of chapters. And I noticed something different this time than any other time when I've passed, is that instead of just having a no trespassing sign in front of that particular lodge, that particular gun club, duck club, and you must know that I have our land, our farm in Corinne is mainly there for the birds. And so I am a hunter. Historically, I don't get out as often as I used to. A consumptive hunter, meaning I would shoot ducks, I would shoot geese, I would shoot swans. But that particular gun club that's mentioned in Refuge, that has a name and it's given in the book, I noticed that there are no trespassing signs around their buildings were gone. And now there are signs that say, this is the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. So I don't know what that really means, but it looks like maybe they sold out and the federal government picked up their land, and now where those burrowing owls disappeared may now be protected land of the Bear River Bird Refuge, which I interpret as that's a happy thing for me, despite having these conflicts that I've mentioned of my personal use of the land and use of the birds.
Elizabeth, I wondered if you have any comments or questions or thoughts about what we've been talking about.
Well, what I've been thinking about has to do with conservationism as far as our water usage. We're talking about climate change and less water coming into our system, but when you talk about the values, how hard it's been for people to adjust during the pandemic to making changes that ideally would benefit the whole if it's based on correct information, as we're learning new things all the time about the situation we're in. What about our values as it pertains to conservation for our water usage? How's Utah doing? Are we willing to water our lawns less or put in xeriscaping, something to help that, to take shorter showers?
I haven't looked at the figures for water usage in Salt Lake, but I know that from reading editorials about St. George, where there's a proposed pipeline to carry Lake Powell water to St. George. And what's the use of a pipeline if there isn't enough water to flow from Lake Powell is one question, but rather St. George is an enormous user of water, and rather than xeriscaping and so forth, they kind of apparently resist lowering their water usage. And so they're kind of a model for us in the north. And I don't know what our water usage is, but I know it's greater than it needs to be. And I say that having a big garden that I water. So, but anyway, others commented on that. What Elizabeth proposed, thoughts?
One quick note, that if you look at a water budget for most any body of water, including the Bear River, the vast majority of the water is used for agriculture. I don't know what it is for the Bear River right off the top of my head, but I'd guess that probably at least 60% of the human use of the Bear River, the use and depletion, is agriculture. So if I say it that way, it sounds like we can't take that money away because we're taking away food that's going into our bellies or whatever. We're taking food away from the babies. But in actuality, a lot of that water is going to raise crops that humans don't eat directly. They take a couple of steps and feed that hay to a cow or a sheep, just for John's benefit. My grandfather on one side of the family were sheep and cattle ranchers, and on the other side was a plumber. Larson Brother Plumbing still exists, Elizabeth and Richard Carr. You
I
might go
just
on.
used them.
Okay, Alan Dixon, I graduated from high school with. I don't know if a tall, skinny old guy with the same color of hair, if he has any left.
Still with them.
Okay.
I have his
Anyway.
number.
Okay, I haven't talked to him for a while, but he's done plumbing for me. I can't remember how I got off on that tangent. The point is, perhaps bigger, Elizabeth, than whether we take a longer shower or whatever. We need to manage how we use waters in ways that we don't see directly, such as through agriculture and the kind of foods we eat. Oh, there's a Brigham City name. Okay.
If the bird refuge slowly is depleted of water and therefore not as inviting to the birds, are they going to alter their migratory routes and find other ways? Because there's other water areas that they might go to, or is that not a factor?
The deltas of the Bear River and of the marshes of the Great Salt Lake are an enormous oasis and attractor for the birds through this central flyway. Not the true central flyway, but this inland western flyway. And there is not a rest stop of anywhere near the magnitude of the current Bear River Bird Refuge that those birds can land in and spend some time to recoup the migration costs going north and south. It's a vital stopover spot.
One thing Terry Tempest Williams says in the book is that she discovered that some of the birds, and as Riley has pointed out, certainly it wasn't all of them, but some of them were migrating via the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, which is later made famous by the Bundys, who held a standoff there. But she says in the book that some of the birds, at least, that were used to visiting the Great Salt Lake went to that refuge. So, or you went that route. And I don't know how accurate that is, Riley, but
the banding patterns show that some of them can be accommodated by the Malheur. I've been up on the Malheur. It is another big refuge, but it is roughly longitude-wise, about 2 days flight west of where the birds would come straight down through Bear River or straight down through Malheur to get south. So it's 2 extra days for them. And you must recognize that the Malheur is already at its carrying capacity, more or less, for how many birds it can stand when it's at full migration time. Yeah. The resources are used in large part by the birds already.
What you're basically saying is that the bird refuge and the conservation of it needs to have a voice in how we allocate our water resources.
That's correct.
It needs to have as big a voice as agriculture, almost.
Yeah.
Who will speak for the birds is a humanities question that has been asked by quite a number of environmental writers in the past. Who will speak to those that are without voices? Who will speak for the people of perhaps lower income inner city people? Who is their advocate? So it's a parallel question.
In that line, I guess I have a second question, because the people who set up the refuge were essentially locals who hunted the birds and probably themselves were involved in agriculture. And what is your sense of, like, who would advocate now for the refuge? Often hunters make greater commitments to the outdoors than what we might generally characterize as a person in a city who loves the environment. Hunters spend more time outside in that environment, and through their fees and even just investing in their equipment, spend more money on the actual land and the protection of that land. And here, people who hunt probably are also the people who are in agriculture. Is your sense that there's still a lot of support for the refuge among that community? It seems like the locals would be the #1 advocates for a refuge.
Yes, so I have my small farm of that I'm a part owner in with my cousins of 160 acres. That's just a tiny little drop. That's like Elizabeth's example of a shower, shortening a shower compared to how big other land uses are. We are a family of hunters. My grandfather was a hunter, and my great-grandfather was a hunter, and they did some things, my ancestors, that made it so that the populations of ducks and geese were dramatically limited. They went down a lot. And later, we couldn't get access, my grandfather couldn't get access to a place where he could go to hunt because of the privatization of all the land. And so he used the capitalistic idea of go buy your own land and practice the same idea. So some of those fees that that Richard, you had from Larson Brothers Plumbing, from that local industry of plumbing, my grandfather funneled part of his wealth, if you will, monetary wealth, into preserving that 160 acres of duck and goose habitat. Does that make any sense what I'm saying here? And that now I continue to do that. My cousin, I only have one cousin left who hunts on a regular basis and some of his children, but the birds pay a tax, kind of, what's that that movie where they put them in a dome and then they run around shooting at each other from each village, and it's from about, what was that, Elizabeth? Hunger Games. So I feel a little bit like the Hunger Games, where I'm the bad guys in the big city, where we're making the birds fly by and we take a tax on the birds and eat a few of them. But more to the point, Thomas, I know of farmers, total for-profit farmers from Corinne, and I could use their names, but I'm choosing not to, that they work very carefully to preserve the land and to conserve the land for the birds. And these are well-known names that you would know. I'll say it, the Ferry family of Corinne, John Ferry, Ben Ferry, their one son of that family really works hard to give a voice to the birds.
I think that's, I'm all for greater communication so that the environmentalists and the hunters and the farmers are having conversations about this, because that's essential. You know, you're right. The hunters really do pay for a lot of preservation. It's not connected to the book Refuge, but in England, someone in my department went and studied fox hunting in England. And about 10 years ago, they had environmentalists in England get enough political power that they banned fox hunting. And that would have reduced drastically green space in England, because the people who were hunting, the people with estates kept them so that they could go fox hunting, and kept them with the pathways traditional that anybody can use, so that everybody has access to these areas to a certain extent. And so they came up with an elegant compromise that nobody talks about. They passed the ban, so fox hunting is banned, but it still goes on. You know, and so the green space is preserved, and the environmentalists are happy because they passed the law. And so what happens is well, if we're out riding one day and there is a fox there, well, and our horses and dogs take off after it, well, what can we do? You know, so there's a kind of a slippery compromise between environmentalists and landowners and hunters in England that maybe we can be a little more slippery with each other and get along. I don't know how it would work, but anyway.
John, if you choose not to respond to this, I could say it, but I think that you've helped my family form a land use operation out on our land out in Corinne. Is that true, John?
That is true. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but not see you.
And I don't know how to make myself visible, but yes, I did. I haven't met you personally, but I remember the name when you mentioned what was being done.
Okay. So like I say, I'm this much exactly vested in that land.
You are, yes.
As in terms of ownership, but my heart is there to a much greater extent. And John, maybe at the bottom of your screen, over on if you're using a computer, sort of on the left-hand side, there's a thing that says start video or stop video. That might help you if you're using a computer.
There we go.
There you are.
Yeah, okay. Well, I agree with what you're saying about hunters, and perhaps even to add to that, the conservation movement we have in America started with hunters and has been promoted by hunters. And folks who are non-hunters are certainly very, very important, and we all should be in this together, and we are. But I think without hunters, we wouldn't have a conservation movement like we do today. Hunters have started a conservation movement, preserved it, and folks who are non-hunters have joined in that in recent years. I've been involved with the bird refuge through a group called the Friends of the Refuge for many years. And we were able to put together assorted and surprisingly different types of people to get that refuge rebuilt. And we're still, although I'm not involved with it any longer, the group is still involved in the process of bringing people into the fold, adding to the land that's in the refuge, and improving the refuge itself. I will use a few names. We got money from, well, basically the Eccles family. What we discovered in getting into this was that all the money in Utah belongs to the Eccles family. at least all the money that's available through the various foundations. Really, I think at least 50% of the foundations in Utah who are interested in conservation and the environment are Eccles related.
So thank you, Eccles.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
But thank you for working to get all those people together. If I'm going to offer any critique of the book, it's that part of the way she creates her narrative that's so engaging is to be quite polemical. That it's even in her own family, the Tempests were construction people, and so she's often at odds with her own family over that. And so she makes her mileage out of her narrative by being very polemical about this, and which doesn't encourage people from different areas of interest in the water to talk to each other. So I'm pleased that you, John, were able to pull a lot of different kinds of people together and do some good. Does Laura or Grant or Randy have a question? The silent majority, the hidden presence. I have a question for the group then. a lot of the book is about identity being a product of belonging to a place. And a lot of people on this talk right now are from Box Elder County. My place is out in the West Desert, south of Tooele. I grew up in a town called Vernon, and my family has ranched in the southern end of Rush Valley there for 5 generations. And so that's my place. Many of you are from Box Elder County. What do you think about the virtue of having a place that you identify with? So I'm asking a question of the whole group. Thomas, you moved to Brigham City. So is that your place now, or is there another place?
Yeah, I've only been here 2 years. I did go to USU in the 90s. I did a master's there. So that helped us decide to move back to northern Utah at this stage. I am from the East Coast. I grew up in Virginia. And so, gosh, that feels still a lot more like home sometimes than here. But we have chosen this place to, this is where we want to be now. And I would say, so I'm kind of in transition between what used to be home and what is becoming home. And I did really like being in northern Utah in the 90s. As I transition, sometimes I do miss the East because I know it, and there's a lot of just memories connected with places there, and those are powerful. And so I kind of feel like I'm in that transition. I need to make memories here connected to places, and that will be important. And that in something becoming a home, I don't know how many generations my family would stay here, but the refuge and also going up into the mountains, both, the headwaters, like I was able to I'm a teacher, I spent some time with Bryce Passy, who does education at the refuge and takes students up to each year, the 4th and 5th graders, I think, in Box Elder and Cache counties. He takes them all up to the elk refuge up there and talks about headwaters, and then comes down to the wildlife refuge here in Bear River Wildlife Refuge and talks about downstream and how important that is, and they test the water and talk about the different uses that different ways humans use the water and wildlife needs the water. And activities like that, whether they're personal or with a group, I just think are really important to making a place home. When you find yourself outside when you didn't expect to be outside, or in weather that you didn't expect to be in, that starts to make the place a place you call home. And that's the process I'm in right now.
And the word home is one word, but the word refuge is another one, that she found solace and encouragement and even feelings of awe on the refuge when her family was in trouble. So I think that's perfectly in line with what we've been talking about. And it struck me, John Bunderson, that you had to have a great love of place to go all the work to pull that coalition of people together to rebuild something that was lost, because you loved the place.
I definitely love the place. And you talk about having a home or having a feeling of being or belonging in a particular place. I haven't lived a lot of other places, but we've done some traveling, and I was in the service for a while. And every time we go somewhere, I can't wait to get home. I don't know what it is. For what it's worth, I think America might be a better place if we had less rootlessness than we do now. And I've watched that develop in my lifetime. And I don't like it, but I guess I'm getting old enough that there's some things that, like all people with gray hair, there you get to the point where you think things were better the way they used to be. But I do agree. I do think that we all need a home, if you will. We all need a place. And this is my place. We've watched sunsets pretty much all over the world, and I can see the prettiest sunsets I've ever seen just off our deck in my backyard. We've always commented on that. So. And that's the sun setting right over the refuge, too.
Richard, your place.
Place has a lot to do with family. It's connected to family as much as it is to location. For me, anyway, my family moved around quite a bit, so we're all spread out now. And for me, that has as big a tie as a location. So there are places that are preferable, but there's also family that attracts you to certain other locations.
I'm interested in your thoughts, Willie, because I'm not sure where you moved from when you moved to Salt Lake, or.
Yeah, so my parents are from El Salvador originally, and then I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and lived for like the first half of my childhood in Newark, New Jersey, before moving on over to South Jordan, Utah, where I spent kind of the rest of my formative years and did undergrad at Westminster College. And what I think, what the past, like, especially like 2 years, I was in Cedar City, and now I'm back in Salt Lake City and doing this work with Utah Humanities, where I'm all over the state. And what I feel like is, when I was growing up, I had one image of the state and like what it meant to be from Utah, or like what sort of people were there. And then as I've gotten to explore around for the past 2 years, it's been a lot of like discovering things about Utah I was never told. Everything from like, discovering Terry Tempest Williams, where I was like, wow, I went to like undergrad in Utah and didn't bump into her text until like last year. And that blew my mind. Everything from that to the histories of indigenous people. So there's like a lot of different histories in Utah that, yes, aren't shared. And I feel like the Migratory Bird Refuge is one of those things where it's like, wow, I lived in Utah for how long? And I didn't know that this great like blessing was just a bit north. And I guess that's kind of where I'm at with this conversation. And when I think about place, I feel like I'm rediscovering Utah as a place and a home. When I think about, I feel like the questions I have about the bird refuge has to do with that thing I brought up a little bit earlier, is like how it has changed since people have settled here. Because before, there was, my understanding, a lot of hunter-gatherer Shoshone folks. And I'm curious, yes, what was the refuge like then? Was it like bigger or was it smaller? I know that a lot of the waterways and like the rivers all across Utah exist because of a lot of intervention that makes it possible for people to be able to sustain life here. So that's where my brain is at. It's just like spinning all around as I'm like processing and learning more about the refuge.
So that's Riley, you talk about that because you mentioned on our trip, and I think it was edited out of the film, that the deltas once were a valuable resource for birds, but that depleted, possibly because of agriculture, and they had to build the dike around the refuge in order to preserve that had been valuable before. Is that accurate? Or?
That's right. We're in the management of the refuge. Non-natural barriers, dikes, have been built to hold the water in places for a longer period of time. Instead of going just, if you will, oozing into the Great Salt Lake, it is now moved through a series of spillways and waterways that allow the water to be in different parts of the bird refuge at different times of the year. And managers, biologists, and conservationists monitor carefully the growth of the plants and such in those different lakes, to know where to put the water at particular times of the year. And it gets, in essence, human management of the Bear River's water has increased, in essence, the time that it takes that water to turn into the Great Salt Lake. And because of that, there is a different kind of set of birds here than might have been there originally. But that being said, the early accounts of people like John C. Fremont floating down the Bear River and getting out towards the edge of the Great Salt Lake, they all mentioned the wings of thunder, of how many big waterfowl birds there were in that area. So the change has been there, and we're holding on to those former levels by the management we have. And so the Bear River Bird Refuge is not what we would call a totally natural kind of place, but it's under the influence of human management, where we're putting this land for the birds, for the hunters, for the birds, for the bird watchers with binoculars, for the birds for their own use, without the birds paying a lick of attention to the hunters or the binocular bearers. And how I measure our humanity is that we are willing to give part of our wealth, if you will, so the birds can do with that wealth what they want to do, rather than us to always look for the exact bottom line of how it's feathering my nest.
Riley, would you describe what we saw with those adolescent pelicans?
It was wonderful. I have never got to see in the video. There's the pelicans of northern Utah. Their major breeding population is out in an island in the middle of the Great Salt Lake. So to feed their babies, the adult pelicans during breeding season have to commute 30 miles to the marshes of the Great Salt Lake to catch the fish that they do there, the chubs and now the carp and the catfish, and then they carry it back in their bodies that 30 miles. So they have a 60-mile commute each day, 30 in, 30 out, to feed their babies. Now the babies have grown their feathers on their wings, and they can leave those islands of the Great Salt Lake, and now they're spending their formative years at the Bear River Bird Refuge and other places, and they're having to learn how to cooperate. And they do amazing social things of cooperative feeding, where they see that if my fingers represent 8 birds, they can synchronize their diving and funnel the fish into an area where they, as a group, get more fish out of the water than if they were to hunt individually. And at one point in the video, which was, I've never got to see this in my life, I had these teenage punk pelicans sitting in a canal behind me, and I could watch them, trying to figure out how to, it's like going to a Box Elder high school dance and figuring out how to cooperate to get something good, if you will, to happen maybe later.
And so they would herd fish into a corner, and then the diving would go in a wave across the backs of the pelicans. And so it was really something to see. It was pretty marvelous.
And as knowing how Wade moves on to Way, I doubt if I can ever come back. I doubt that I will ever get to see that. Again, I'll have to go out of my way to go out to the Bear River Bird Refuge in the middle of the hot summer when the pelicans are big, rather than to go at prime time Bear River Bird Refuge time in the springtime or the late fall. Serendipity came to me where I could see those pelicans for the first time in a different way. In other words, see them for the first time as teenagers. Now they aren't really multiple years. This year's crop of pelicans, that they already have a wingspan as big as my 6 feet. I'm 6'4", but they already have a wingspan about like that. But they're learning from each other how to cooperate. That was just boggling for this latest visit to the Bear River Bird Refuge.
Before we leave talking about home and refuge as a place, maybe it's a little bit of a disconnect, but I thought it would be interesting for Elizabeth to talk about how a library is a refuge. That's a little departure from what we're doing, but I think as one of the partners, that is important to you, and maybe you, it would be neat to hear what you have to say about that.
I don't know if I'll speak very well to it, but I'll try. We have a lot of people who come here every day. And as they come into the library, we see them in the morning. We're a small town library, so we get to know a lot of our regular patrons really, really well. And so when we see some of these people who come in every single day, walk through the door first thing in the morning, we say hello, and it takes on just kind of a, I guess you could say even a family feel, because we're such a small community. We don't know everybody in town because we are big enough that we can't. But for those that are regular, we get to know them. And when they don't show up one day, we worry. We think, what happened? I hope they're okay. But for those people, I think that this really is a place that they can come and they can sit and just enjoy the ambience of the building, talk to other people who come. Maybe there's nobody else at home for them to talk to. Sometimes we'll overhear patrons that are just sitting across the room from each other start to engage in conversation. I know our reference librarian told me once that there was an older man sitting on one corner of the room and a younger man on the other, and they started to talk, and they found out they were both interested in real estate, and the older man had all of this experience and the younger man was just getting started, and they were talking, and there was some mentoring going on. And so there's just so many things, whether it's connecting with other people in a library and a program like this, whether it's on Zoom or physically in our building, connecting with other patrons who come into the building, or connecting with a book. We do a lot of author events too, and it's amazing how many authors will say that they didn't like to read when they were kids, but their librarian found the right book for them and they just took off. So even the things on our shelves, our books, can be a place of refuge for people, because within those pages, there's humanity. And there's something that we can all identify with and tap into. So I don't know if that addresses the question very well.
I didn't know what, I loved what you said. I didn't know what would happen when I asked the question.
Oh.
Growing up out in Vernon, out in the desert, we didn't have a library. There was a library in Tooele, which was 35 or 40 miles away. And so we had the bookmobile, and that certainly was a refuge to me in my young years and my teenage years, getting two dozen books every 2 weeks when the library would come. Anyway, I appreciate what you said.
If you don't know her, Elizabeth, hope you will recognize the name Lapriel White. Lapriel White was the librarian of my youth.
Oh.
And
It
I can
sounded
remember.
familiar.
What? Say that again.
It sounded familiar, but I couldn't place the name at first. I think I've seen pictures of her.
She, her house was at the corner of First West and Second North. It's still there, and my cousin Ned Young, the artist, just about bought her house instead of the old house he bought that used to belong to the Readers over down at the end of Third West on 6th North. But Lapriel White introduced me to books, and I found a refuge, and I would dare say I haven't said the name Lapriel White in 30 years. So you are a surrogate Laprille White for me as you're sitting in that refuge where where you are.
I don't know. I keep looking at Willie and he doesn't seem nervous. So I have one more comment or something, and then we can either do what Willie tells us to do. But there, I was a young faculty member at BYU when the philosophy department invited a famous atheist philosopher, I think his name was Richard Rorty, to BYU's campus. And here were all these old BYU professors, and being at BYU, their goal was to trip him up because he was an atheist, you know, and they were trying a little bit to convert him and show him the error of his ways. And so they were pressing him about how to make ethical decisions if there is no God. And he said the utilitarian statement that it's the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which is difficult when you're in Utah and managing water that is not sufficient. What's the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Well, that's a tangled web. But so they said, how do you make predictions about the future? You know, how do you imagine a situation where you haven't experienced and you cannot identify what the best good for the greatest number of people is? And he said, you read novels. And he said that's where values and ethics and questions about values and ethics reside. And this is not, Refuge is not a novel, but it works like a novel in that it's pursuing a questioning of a set of values. Where is my refuge? Is it in the landscape? Is it in my family? Is it in the animals? Is it in the history of the Goshutes and the other people? You know, where is my refuge? And I think a book like Terry Tempest Williams' book, Refuge, enables us to reconsider our own values and to decide what's most important to us. So whoever came up with the idea of pairing books, and that was probably Willie, pairing books and water, that's a great idea.
I wish I could take complete credit. Thank you so much, John and Riley. This is actually a bigger part of a water circus that's happening all around Utah for the next year or two. If you go to Utah Humanities website and look at Think Water Utah, you can see other events going around everywhere. And a lot of them are virtual now, which is great because if there was something happening in Camas or something happening in St. George, normally a lot of folks in Brigham City wouldn't be able to do it, but now, all it takes is a Zoom link. Thank you so much, John and Riley, for your insights and for your great stories and stuff about the refuge. And thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your support with Brigham City Library, helping make this happen. And thank you everybody who joined us. This was a really engaging conversation. I feel like I learned a lot about the refuge, and I hope y'all did too. Does anybody have any last burning question that they want to put out there before we head out?
This is not a question. This is just Riley talking. But John mentioned the utilitarian way of looking at resources. But there's another famous conservationist who happened to be largely coming from a science background, named Aldo Leopold, wrote a book, The Sand County Almanac. And in that book, he talked about how you need to think like a mountain, is one of the ideas that came out of his book. But he coined a phrase that has been a bit of a mantra or a bit of a guidance to me in my life. He states in that book, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to save the pieces. We can take things apart and think we know how they work, and many of us have taken something apart this way, and then put it back together, and yet we still have a little handful of pieces. And we think, well, those engineers, maybe we think, those engineers didn't know what they were doing. This thing that I've rebuilt still works, so these must be worth less, these extra pieces. The rule of the tinkerer says, save the pieces, put them in your junk drawer, and you don't know, maybe there was a function that they had that you didn't see at the time when you were working with it. The first rule of intelligent tinkering is save the pieces. So we don't know how humans are going to benefit from having huge flocks of birds out of the bird refuge. From a pure human benefit, we don't know if the cure, the vaccine for COVID-19 is going to come from some bird that has learned how to deal with the mutation rates in this virus in their population. And we'll be able to partner with the bird and move that into our system. We've done that repeatedly as humans. So let's not throw away the pieces of the Bear River Bird Refuge or whatever, just because we don't know what they do. Save the pieces.
Thank you so much, Riley. Thank you so much, John. We are at 8:16, which is a little over what we were planning to be, but thank you so much for staying for the engaging conversation. And there's going to be other Humanities in the Wild coming up. Next, we're going to the Ogden at the Overlook Trail. So you can follow Utah Humanities pages to see when those pop up. And we'd love to have you all again. Thank y'all so much.
And if you contact me by email if you wish, that's at BYU, Riley Nelson at BYU.
Ditto, John Benyon. Thank you. Thank you, Willie.
Thank
Goodbye.
you very
Well,
much.
thank you, Willie,
Take
for
care,
bringing
y'all.
this up so we could partner. And thank
For
you,
sure.
John and Riley,
Yeah.
and all of you.
Thank you.
There's